The Modhouse Tungsten are some of the most hyped headphones in recent times, such that they have a 6 to 8 month back order if you want to buy a pair. They're 3D printed headphones. I mean, you can see that they have a basically a 3D printed finish, but the overall design and quality and sound quality is pretty impressive for their $2,000 asking price. Now, I never thought I'd be able to get hold of a pair of these, but I was lucky in that when reviewing the ENLEUM HPA-23RMH, they made an H version which comes with the Modhouse Tungsten in a kit, and ENLEUM sent me the kit for me to review. So lucky I am in that. For a, well, basic looking pair of headphones, they look, well, if you don't look up closely, they look pretty impressive. I mean, the only thing that's really missing on them is a nice painted finish such as you got on the Dan Clark Audio headphones. And I mention that because there seems to be something of a trend of manufacturers starting off making modifications to Fostex planar headphones and then moving on to making their own 3D printed models. And that's how Dan Clark Audio started, as well as Zach from ZMF Audio, although he went down a slightly different path with wood-cupped headphones. But anyway, it's interesting that two well-known manufacturers that have very much taken off and now make their own models have started off down this way. And now we have a third potentially heading that way, especially if, given how successful these are, if they pull off a newer pair of headphones with improvements to this design, then they could end up being quite a successful manufacturer. Anyway, we're stepping ahead of ourselves. As designs go, well, it has a steel metal headband. It's around 500 grams in weight, and basically uses the standard kind of clicky system that you get on headphones such as Odyssey and the like, and ends up being very, very comfortable to listen to music with this simple cloth headband, and well, everything can be unscrewed. If you want to adjust the clickiness of the headphones, they have a set screw in here, and there's also an outer set screw if you want to lock them in place. So they've thought of all the main things initially. One of the other things you can do is they come with 2 sets of Earpads. The second set, which I've got sitting over here, are people are calling the hybrid pads, which are cloth. They're basically Earpads, well, in this case, mostly cloth Earpads stuck to a metal plate. And these Earpads are basically held on by the magnets that form part of the driver. Now, the back of these, you'll see there's a grill on the metal plate, and that aligns perfectly with the magnets, basically. So it ends up becoming, well, part of the whole structure. I think the good thing about this is that, and this is something I want to talk about later, is that these kind of metal surfaces can end up reflecting a lot of sound back and causing distortion. And with these Earpads sitting really flush in here and leaving no gap, and just in between the Earpad and the metal plate there's only cloth, that reduces any potential reflections and probably helps a lot with the sound quality. Something I'm going to talk about in another video, which will be quite interesting. I think in the end, maybe the metal on the front may have some potential for reflecting sound, and maybe that probably adds a little bit to the sound of them. Of course, lastly, they came with this nice Viking weave cable, which is, well, it's pretty. And I only got a single-ended version to use with the ENLEUM HPA-23RMH. Yeah, Asian companies do love their model numbers and their model names. Yeah, okay. So I actually used most of the time a Meze copper cable, which I've been using with the Susvaras unveiled as well for listening, because it's also very short and my system is right next to me. So if there is any kind of influence in the sound quality from changing the cables in that regard, there may be a little bit, then forgive me for that. I'm not going to go into detail about cable sound. But what I will go into detail is about the sound with the different pads. With the hybrid pads, well, they give somewhat of a tamed sound versus the leather or perforated pads, as some people call them. The leather or perforated pads, with them on and everything completely stock, as these are not mine and I'm not going to modify them or even attempt to, does sound a little bit on the exciting side, with maybe a little bit of north of neutral mid bass and a little bit exciting kind of upper mid treble area, around the 3 kilohertz, 4 kilohertz mark. Actually, considering the piano's highest notes only go up to about 4 kilohertz, it's and we can kind of think of that as treble, it does put things in perspective. And with a slight pullback, I've, at least from my perception and also from measurements, at around the 2 kilohertz mark, that suggests that is very common on headphones such as from HiFiMan, Sennheiser, Meze and others, versus, say, the research done for the Harman target curve, that gives them an ever so slight V shape to the signature, giving a little bit of an exciting sound with the perforated pads that suits most listening genres very, very well. That's unfortunately very tamed by the cloth pads, which kind of brings down the treble a bit and brings the range in the bass a bit. And to me, ends up sounding a little bit boring, at least in all the amps I tried. So basically, most of the listening I did was with the perforated pads, so we're going to leave the cloth pads to one side. Now, the main issue with these is the sensitivity. For the uninitiated, the amount of sensitivity a pair of headphones have is how much power they require to get to a certain listening level, or rather how loud they get with a certain amount of power. Usually it's decibels per milliwatt or decibels per volt. In this case, it's usually decibels per milliwatt is most common, and these are way down at 78, whereas most headphones are somewhere at least in the 90s or sometimes often over 100. So that means they require the kind of drive like a speaker amp to really get loud. Now with power requirements, basically for every 10 decibels you need 10 times the amount of power. With 155 ohm impedance, which is a lot higher than a very common, say 32 ohms or 40 or even 60, although lower, of course, than the Sennheiser HD800s, which are like 300 to 600 ohms, depending on what frequency you measure them at. The combination of low sensitivity and a higher impedance means that to get these loud very fast or to get very punchy type bass, you do need serious amplification. Now, as the amount of power required goes up by 10 times for every 10 decibels, a person who's listening, say, at quieter levels to, say, a jazz ensemble is not going to have the kind of requirements that someone who listens to, say, a movie soundtrack with 20 hertz bass, listening at a louder level is going to require. I can easily listen to, say, 20 hertz bass at, say, a much higher SPL, such as, 90, 100, or even 110 dB. Then I could musical instruments or vocals, which sound pretty piercing to me once I hit about 90 dBs. So we're talking a kind of difference of like 100 times the power requirement difference between people who listen quieter to simpler music versus movie soundtracks much, much louder. So that if you see online that people's impressions of how these sound varies considerably, that's probably why. Now, if we look at some graphs of some various headphones, let's take a look at, say, a regular pair of well-known planers, the Odyssey LCD-XCs, or LCD-Xs are pretty much the same. You can see from the graph that they can even get up to an ear-splitting 120 decibels with only 100 milliwatts of power, and only, say, less than 1.5 volts, and next to no current. Now, if you take some more demanding headphones, such as the Sennheiser HD800s, the voltage requirements of those are much greater. As long as your headphone amp can output, say, about 3 volts, you're going to get to pretty ear-splitting levels. But they require near zero current, so they still require only about 210 milliwatts to get to 120 decibels. So you can drive them actually not badly out of pretty simple gear, although they may not sound the best, because you want to look at the steepness of that voltage line and you'll see that it jumps up pretty quickly. And that's where amps have trouble. It's not a static number where they have to reach that number and stay there. It's something that fluctuates a great deal when listening to music. And the ability of the amp to ramp up power instantaneously is where a lot of amplifiers fall apart. Either they can't get enough voltage going or they can't get the current going quickly enough. Now, if we take a more demanding pair of headphones like Dan Clark Audio Stealth and Expanse, now we're looking at the somewhere in the low 90s in terms of sensitivity, and with a low impedance, they end up requiring quite a bit of current to get going, 330 milliamps, which isn't really a huge amount. Once you combine it with needing a good couple of volts or even more to get going, you end up needing up to, well, as you can see, the power jumps up exponentially. Still, to get to 110 volts, you can deal with 251 milliwatts, which isn't bad. But if you want to listen to those movie soundtracks at loud levels, well, it will jump up at 122, 2.5 watts. And again, it's the rate it ramps up, not just the number. So still, you can drive them out of portable gear, but my experience, if you've seen my videos, is that it isn't quite as good at all compared to using a very good full-sized amplifier. Now, the big king of the Susvaras, which were always had a reputation for being hard to drive. Again, we have these figures here. Basically, double the Stealth and Expanse, where we're looking at 110 dBs, we're looking at still half a watt. Now, suddenly, an amp having to suddenly dump out half a watt of power, well, unless it's like a Class A amp that can already do that, It's going to be certainly maybe running into Class A, B in many cases, and the linearity of the amp may not necessarily be perfect doing so. So that's where the Susvaras often sounds better on a speaker amp that has that kind of power in reserve very easily. And especially the voltage, a lot of amps actually cannot pump out more than a couple of volts very well. And if you're listening to those movie soundtracks, you're going to send the amp into clipping if it has to suddenly send out 5.5 or 6 volts, as I have actually found. That of course leaves then the tungsten, and boom. Yes, that line is going off the charts. And literally, the main issue here, of course, is look at the voltage line. Whereas something like the Susvaras, okay, so you needed, maybe more than 5 or 6 volts ideally. We're looking at 15 to 50 volts to get to super loud levels if you want to listen to those big rumbling movie soundtracks. Now, a lot of people won't do that. And again, remember what I said about listening at quieter levels and listening to simpler music. Well, if you don't have to ramp things up so much, you can get away with simpler amplification. But you do want the amplifiers that can pump out a lot of volts, like 7 or 8 volts to be ideal. So in that case, that left a lot of amps I just didn't even bother testing with. Now, the interesting thing is the gain of the ENLEUM HPA-23RMH is entirely dependent, from the current output at least, on the impedance of the headphones. So higher impedance, higher voltage. So this could drive the tungsten actually pretty well. And again, it only kind of started clipping if I did try the movie soundtrack trick. But for the most part, it actually did pretty well, especially amazing for such a small amplifier. But I only tried the tungsten on the Sirius amps, all of which I have behind me. Now, if I didn't overload the input, the Studio 6 would actually work with some music, but again, it was going to be bass limited in that regard. It was the amps that are built essentially like speaker amps, or built by companies that do make speaker amps, that work really, really well. The most basic one, Shit Audio's Jotunheim, I have back here, but also the more serious stuff, such as the Audio GD Master 9. This is the older version, the R27HE, and it was very noticeable even, say, between the R27HE, which has both a Master 9 and an R7 or R8 built inside it. Because it's sharing the power supply, I found that with the R27HE and other combined Audio GD units, it's the amplifier that suffers the most from sharing the power supply with the DAC. And so the soundstage was a bit more closed in than if I used the R27HE to the Master 9, whereas the soundstage was nice and open. Now, the other thing about this sound with these is that because they're tuned, say, through the bass to be fairly flat, like the old IETF, standard flat tuning, that, if you compare that to, say, a Harman curve, gives me the same perception as having a little bit more mid-bass than is totally neutral. And that's actually something I quite like. Now, the thing is with very insensitive headphones is they'll put heavy demands on the amplifier, and you'll notice that in the bass first. So when I noticed that the amplification was somewhat limited with some of the amplifiers, I noticed the bass went out of control first. It was not so much a problem, of course, with the bigger amps like the Master 9 and things like the GSX Mini, which are built more or less like a speaker amp as well, and even things like the Jotunheim, of course, which sound more closed in and you could hear less detail than with the bigger amplifiers and bigger systems. I was sad to find out the good old Luxman P750U, which I borrowed from my friend, is no longer here in the rack, did not do a particularly good job with these. And it's not necessarily such a surprise, as Luxman doesn't seem to quite keep up with what's kind of popular at them in the headphone world, which is kind of sad, as they're very, very competent. There were times too, of course, that the good old Studio 6, which only has 1.2 watts of output, couldn't quite keep up either. Although with a lot of listening, it was very pleasant having that slight tube sound. With the ENLEUM, which sounds a little bit more kind of, I don't want to say cold and analytical, a little bit more analytical, has a lack of coloration. That was certainly very apparent through the tungstens, and it gave a slightly more analytical presentation of the music. I like that slight tube bloom you get usually from things like the Studio 6 and the Luxman, because they make things sound a little bit wider than they really are. I like that slight artificial touch to the music, although maybe it does rob a tiny bit of detail ultimately from the music. There wasn't any robbing of detail with the ENLEUM, which brought through detail very, very clearly, and probably is one of the clearest amps I've heard to date. The king, of course, of amplifiers, and you can't see it on my desk, you can only see the pigtail connected to the speaker outputs because I connected it to an Audio GD Master 10. That was a step above, only a bit above a Master 9, having the best control of the bass overall. I made it sound the most open and expansive without actually any coloration, at least any very noticeable coloration. So that probably leads me to list my impressions with music. I was listening to some St. Germain, actually the old, high-res remaster of their Tourist album. Now the tungstens have just the right amount of sparkle for this kind of music, and with the leather, at least I should say the leather or perforated pads. And it was really wonderful, kind of punchy bass, running them out of the Master 9 and other amplifiers. Now with that slightly sparkly treble, the slightly smoother sound of the Master 9 amp did work very well in this case with the tungstens, and I really like that combination for this kind of listening. For example, from that Saint Germain album, the better slam of the leather earpads was definitely the go. You know, I could easily turn up the volume on either of the Audio GD units to 70 out of 99, and it was only kind of slightly loud for me, albeit maybe a touch fatiguing in the treble. So I suspect that maybe that metal plate on there is giving a little bit of resonance coming back to the ears, but a little bit of resonance makes the sound a little bit exciting. So these do end up sounding a little bit exciting, and I think that works very well, especially with music such as Tourist, or I don't know, I'm going to pronounce this wrongly, Dian and Carmien, or some other, like what I generally call remix, you know, DJ music, bonobo and that kind of thing. A little bit of excitement does work really well there. Now, in terms of resolution, in that case, listening to good old Massive Attack, I was actually listening to the Spoils from, which is Massive Attack and Hope Sandoval. They tend to be pretty detailed albums. So comparing, say, the Tungsten to more expensive headphones, Stealth, Expanse, and even way more expensive headphones, the Susvaras Unveiled. Now, people have said, oh, you know, these are comparable to the Susvaras. No. That last little bit of note decay coming off instruments was not quite as present with the Tungsten as it was with the $4,000 headphones. So I think the $2,000 price is about spot on for it in terms of resolution. I don't think it's going to beat a $4,000 headphone unless you have a system which just doesn't have the resolution to bring the best out of a $4,000 headphone to begin with. So John Lee Hooker's Too Young from Chill Out, the 2007 remaster, was very compelling listening with the combo with the HPA-23RMH. Using the Chord TT to an M scaler as my source, the Tungsten is, you know, really capable of delivering a fair degree of subtlety of the music, just as it is able to give slam with a powerful amplifier such as the Saint Germain and Massive Attack and the like. And that's one of the good things. It makes a good all-rounder. It isn't just limited to one genre of music. And I think that's one thing that worked really well with what I would call a very slightly V-shaped tuning, is that whatever music I listen to, I could enjoy it really well. The only thing is that maybe that slightly elevated bass versus what might be technically neutral did result in a little bit of bloom from the bass. So it was a little bit imperfect, and that little bit of bloom works well where you have some punchy bass you want to come through and enjoy. But when you're listening to vocals and the like, it tends to interfere slightly with the overall sound. Similarly, listening to good old Fleetwood Mac and Sarah through this combination and the TT to an M scaler, well, it was delivered in a little bit more of a, you know, a monitor presentation, like I already said, in that you hear everything very precisely, including imagery, and that's probably no doubt thanks to the Chord TT to an M scaler, which do image very, very well. But the thing is, to me, that this overall combination, I felt a little bit more moved by the music when I listened to, say, the Susvaras Unveiled and my, you know, the TT to an M scaler with the Studio 6. I do like that little bit of tube bloom in there with that kind of thing, and too much monitor isn't, well, sometimes I listen direct from the TT2 when I really want to hear the musicality of the instruments rather than creating like a little bit of artificial musicality from maybe a less than perfectly mastered song. So I think in that, this particular combination is a touch more, well, what I call, you know, monitor, with maybe most of the excitement coming from the tuning of the headphones. For me, if there was a big kind of powerful amp with, you know, tubes in there, it would probably be my personal ideal for listening with these. So again, when I could listen with these with the Studio 6 and it wasn't pushing them to its limits, then I really enjoyed listening. And again, that's my personal preference at the moment. If you've heard of the new Basement tapes, they have one of my favorite tracks, which is When I Get My Hands on You. And from, again, the ENLEUM, the bass punches through very well if it's not quite as tight as from, say, the Master 10 speaker amp. But of course, it wasn't at all unpleasant with the leather pads on. Like, I didn't feel it was like out of control. I felt like when you have slightly lesser capable amp and you have a pair of, say, somewhat demanding headphones, you do get a bit more looseness in the bass, and that's generally what I experienced. Probably combined with that maybe slightly north of neutral mid bass. What was really fantastic, and I think what these did really well, with things like the black keys, and one of my favorites is called Good Love, which features Billy F. Gibbons and their Dropout Boogie album. And I feel like if the headphones even aren't the last word in resolution, just the general fun and entertainment I got from listening to that track, listening to the guitar, was really fantastic. Now, the elephant in the room, Dan Clark Audio's E3s. Now, if you've got to think about it, Dan Clark, this is the future, the kind of future that I hope that Modhouse has. Dan Clark Audio started off modifying Fostexes. Modhouse started off modifying Fostexes and making their headphones. This is the future, I hope. And not surprisingly, being so many years ahead and so much research ahead, the E3s do sound more overall competent. Now, I'm not necessarily a huge fan of the slightly, more Harman-centric tuning. I think I maybe very slightly prefer the slight pullback versus Harman at 2 kilohertz. But still, when I was switching between, say, the Tungsten and the same track at the same volume level with the E3s were just simply more overall competent. People have wondered, should I wait for a pair of Tungsten versus waiting for the E3s? I think like the overall imaging in the Tungsten does feel like a little bit short of accurate once you've listened with a pair of E3s. So I was listening to various tracks, various acoustic tracks, and I felt that, at least in this pair, the left and the right were slightly off. And I don't know if that's a phase issue or if that's a driver matching issue, but it sounded like the drivers weren't matched as well as, very clearly well matched in the E3s. So that the overall soundstage, and I wouldn't have noticed this so well if I hadn't compared, that there's something slightly wonky between the left and the right in these Tungstens, whereas it's completely clean left to right with the E3s and whatever music I listen to. It feels like, it's just general. Well, look at the difference between the headphones, and the sound was like as different as they look. This is like, okay, someone's very, very competent homemade project, it feels like, whereas the Dan Clark E3s are now a like high quality manufacturing materials and techniques. There's a big difference. But I wouldn't necessarily feel disappointed if you have a pair of Tungsten on order. They are so nice to listen with, and I think that's a really big factor in when listening with the Tungsten, is that when I was talking about, say, resonance in headphones and avoiding that. Now, a lot of headphones do have some kind of resonance in that makes the sound a little bit more exciting. If you have things too overdamped, like you go into, say, a very, very, very overdamped, hi-fi room or something like that. So you could have an anechoic chamber which has all the walls completely damped. It's going to kill the sound entirely. And I think there's a factor of that with headphones in that we do enjoy a little bit of imperfection. There's kind of a perfect imperfection. And if there's a kind of perfect imperfection, the Tungsten are pretty much it. Now, apparently there are mods you can do to improve things here and there slightly. I've even seen someone kind of not like the fact that the grill isn't flush with the edge and have put spaces in between behind the screws or behind the plate, that kind of thing. But if there is an example of perfect imperfection, I'd say that's the Tungsten. They're just so much fun to listen with. They slam so well. They can do delicate music so well. They're not going to do $4,000 headphone level of delicacy, sure, but they are, especially once you power them out of serious gear and in the extreme out of, say, a speaker amp, they end up sounding really fantastic and really enjoyable. The other comparison I did with the Meze Empyreans, which are hiding back on the rack up there, they are, I would call, the king of easy listening. Everything sounds a little bit more distant, a little bit less focused. They're like, I have a friend who is super into, highly detailed in-ear monitors, and he asked me if I should buy a pair of Empyreans, and I said, yeah, I bet they're not really your taste, but he bought them and he just really loves them for the fact that he can relax and listen, and it's just low strain. They're kind of the opposite of the Tungstens in that they're very relaxed. Everything's a little bit distant, a little bit less clear, a little bit less in your face, whereas the Tungstens are super in your face, super rock out headphones, really, getting into the music. It's a really opposite kind of sound. The thing that the Empyreans do better is probably overall imaging, and like the E3s, I think that's the Tungsten's only real failing, at least this pair, is that something's a little bit off about the imaging, and that again could come down to driver matching or some fine details that will probably be worked out in later revisions or later versions or later headphones. So, it's very hard to criticize a pair of headphones that someone put years and years of effort into. I mean, every piece of this, obviously the designer put in a huge amount of effort to get just right and get just the right materials and the shape and the sound and the drivers and everything all together to make a pair of headphones. And I think that's fantastic. So when I kind of say, if you need a pair of $2,000 headphones now, buy a pair of E3s. But, you know, if you do want to be kind of part of the fun, there's nothing wrong with buying, or if you already have ordered a pair of tungstens. I think the real key feeling for me is, can I pick up this pair of headphones and feel like I'm going to enjoy listening to these headphones, enjoy evaluating them just because they're enjoyable to listen with? And the answer is yes. They're exciting, punchy, fun, imperfect. The trebles may be slightly imperfect. The bass is slightly imperfect. Maybe the kind of something the driver matching was imperfect as well. But they are absolutely fun and entertaining to listen with, whether you're going from nuanced music up to really complex and exciting music. Generally excellent. If you end up buying the whole kit, you pair them with something like, say, a Chord Q-Test, which is single-ended as well, like this amp, and you do have a very competent system. And if you end up not liking them, well, heck, because they're back-ordered, someone will pay you for them what they cost new. But they are the kind of headphone that you do need to really build a system around to get the most out of them. So thank you to ENLEUM for sending this over, and thank you to all my patrons for supporting me. If you'd like to support my work, please do click on the link in the description. It's because of supporters that I'm able to continue doing reviews. And if you have a pair, tell us about your experience in the comments below. I'm sure people would love to read not just what I think of the headphones, but also what every other owner does as well. And there'll also be a link to a written review in there, which you can see on here.audio, alongside my other reviews. So as always, thanks once again for watching, and I look forward to chatting with you online.